So welcome. We are talking to the amazing Thomas Henley. I'm not going to go on and list all your achievements. I'll let you do that because you'll be able to do it a lot better than me.
Sure. So, my name is Thomas Henley. I was diagnosed 10 years old with Asperger's and now ASD1, of course, autism. And, throughout my life, I've had a lot of difficulties in terms of the environmental factors around school, various different difficulties in the social world, and I've dealt with a lot of quite severe mental health conditions over my lifetime. I'm 25 now, so it's maybe 11, 12 years. And I started off in a very rough place, and but I really took a shining to the world of science and the world of taekwondo when I was younger. So I used to be a gold national winner in taekwondo, WTF taekwondo, as well as a Commonwealth gold medal. And for a lot of my life, I was focused on those two things. For one on taekwondo and sport, one on sort of sciences. I went to study at the University of Manchester in biomedical sciences, and in that time, I was really, really struggling. Like, at school, you sort of have this environment around you all the time that's kind of tailored for you. You're around the same people each day. Your day is organized and scheduled. And when I moved to university, I suddenly realized that I had to put a lot of effort into trying to make friends and to organize social things to keep my mental health well, and to communicate and to have good experiences. So I was in quite an isolated place, and I decided to start my YouTube channel, which was once Asperger's Growth, now Thomas Henley UK. And I was talking mostly about my experiences with life. Over time, over a good at least 5 years of researching around autism, mental health, trying to understand neurotypicals, the non-autistics in my life, and how to work with them the best, I actually started to make a lot of improvements to my mental health, and also to the things that I struggled with, like the social communication difficulties. So after a while, it started turning into more of a self-improvement channel, trying to help non-autistic people understand what autism is, how to work with us, and also for the other side of talking to autistic adults or parents about how to better understand themselves or their autistic children. And at the moment, I run quite a successful top 5% podcast called the 40 Auti Podcast. I've had guests like Temple Grandin, Professor Baron Cohen, as well as an array of amazing autism advocates online. And I've recently, I work for a charity full time, and on the side I try to manage my podcast and my videos and my social media over on Instagram, which kind of acts like a blog for me, and doing a lot more of training, public speaking, things of that nature in more recent times.
That's fantastic. Like, amazing achievements for anyone, but with the additional kind of barrier. And I think it was interesting what you said about there becomes a realization, and I definitely had that, where you realize that the world is neurotypical, and we're kind of trying to fit in to that, and all the stresses and anxieties and the expectations, particularly if you're lower support needs and able to communicate. There's an even higher expectation on you to achieve.
Yeah.
And that can cause a lot of and also when you fail those, you see yourself in negative eyes, and that can cause a lot of stress and mental health anguish as well. So just hearing you talk about that revelation was very interesting there. And I suppose that's what we are going to kind of talk about there in terms of North Yorkshire County Council's workforce in supporting a lot of these families do come into our services. And so with that initial contact, especially, how would you think it's the best way to kind of build relationships and even just understand the difficulties in communication, the anguish just in emails, text messages, phone calls, and when that person first comes in your home, what that feels like, and how workers can kind of better do it better to support more effectively.
Well, of course, you have two different sort of sides to it, I suppose. Well, maybe three. You could it could be an autistic adult, it could be an autistic child, or it could be solely the parents of autistic children. So it's I think I'm trying to gonna I'm trying to take an angle which kind of encompasses all of them. Um, One thing that's very apparent for me from sort of doing a lot of work in the autism communities online is that there needs to be a lot more autism acceptance, as well as awareness. And it kind of sounds like a bit of a blanket term, but I'll kind of go into some of the reasons why acceptance is a bit different, and why that is just as important as awareness work. Um, one of the main things that I think is kind of a no-brainer is that allowing autistic people, whether they're adults or children, to engage in stimming behaviors, harmless stimming behaviors, is actually
Doing it
very,
now.
very is actually very well. Little things like that, perhaps the more socially acceptable stims, but also the stims like rocking or spinning or using fidget toys and things of that nature. It's actually a really, really massive component in emotional regulation for autistic people. And we tend to struggle with that for a lot of different reasons, mostly due to the prevalence of anxiety or mental health disorders. But um, it's also about our differing sensory systems. So like sometimes the sensory environment for us is a little bit too much, and in some areas we don't get enough input. We're very hyposensitive, so we try to seek that out. So like I'm vestibular and proprioceptive, quite insensitive to those two things. So it means that I like to spin, I like to rock, I like to have motion to try and calm me down. And the thing is that there's other aspects of autism as well as the anxiety, things like alexithymia, struggling to notice and identify sort of background emotions can really contribute towards emotional regulation. So having a method to try and dampen that to try and improve that emotional regulation is very, very important. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong, especially with autistic children. I think, in sort of a more of a general sense, I think a lot of work around the awareness of neurodiversity is quite important, and it's a relatively new concept, but it's sort of been around in the background, perhaps not defined as neurodiversity before. But it's basically about a number of different things. The first one, I guess, would be showing the positive aspects of being autistic. Quite often, especially under the medical model of disability, we place a lot of the focus of the difficulties that an autistic person is having on the fact that they're just autistic, and we're not taking into consideration the other things as well as the positives that can actually make them valuable to society. Things like hyper concentration, special interest, the ability to approach things from different angles and actually make things clear that perhaps people who aren't autistic won't be able to see.
Yeah.
There's also been a really big push for some kind of more tailored diagnostic criteria for women,
Yeah.
and people of different minorities, because the current sort of diagnostic criteria is very, very effective for men, for boys. It's not so effective for women because of the concept called masking. Sort of, they're very good at hiding the fact that they're autistic, as well as sort of being naturally a little bit more inclined to mirroring behaviors, like copying other people around them. So it can make them very difficult to spot, and it is quite important to get that diagnosis early, because it puts them in a good place to get support for the rest of their lives. I think the last thing that I would say is, we need to have, as a society, especially when we're looking at conditions like autism and ADHD, those kind of neurodiversity conditions, we need to put more of a focus on the social factors, the things around them. The social model of disability is quite widely accepted by a lot of people. The fact that it's not the individual that's the cause of the issues, it's the environment around them, the education, the workplace, the culture, the stigmas. There's such a massive amount of social factors which can lead us to developing a lot of co-occurring conditions, like what I experienced. And those key things are isolation, either at school, or due to masking. Sometimes that could be a thing, but also, in later life, for late diagnosed individuals who have really gone their whole life pretty much in solitude, perhaps maybe knowing one or two people and sort of meeting with them a little bit. And I've had quite a few people who have found my work, and it's been quite revelationary for them, because they've never really had a reason to go out there and try and work on themselves and build a network. Another aspect is bullying. It's no lie that there are some aspects to being there are a few aspects to being autistic that make us quite vulnerable targets, particularly slower social emotional development, as well as sort of stigmatizing due to stimming, or perhaps things related to not really understanding the indirect communication that's very, very common. Discrimination is obviously a big one. A lot of workplaces, discrimination and unemployment could kind of be tied in together, because even if we have a big push for diversity, there's often a really big focus on diversity rather than the inclusion aspects. So there might be some programs to get autistic people into the workplace, but the culture is not there, the support is not there, the workplace doesn't understand them, both managers and co-workers, and so they get quite socially isolated or bullied, even in the adult world. And that can lead them to dropping out of school, or it can lead them dropping out of the workplace. So really what I'm talking about in terms of reducing the social factors, it's trying to reduce the things that cause us to develop co-occurring conditions like depression, anxiety, things like low self-confidence. It's kind of mostly tied to a lot of autistic people. It's only the people that I come across that haven't really experienced these social factors that seem to be doing the best in life, and they seem to, be much more successful in not every single area that they enter.
Oh, thank you, Thomas. And I think it's interesting, just the lack of knowledge in this country in particular. When I've done training with parents of neurodiverse children, I always tell them there's going to be tears because of the genetic factors that potentially the vast majority will probably have neurodiversity as well, and they've gone their whole life probably thinking they're failing as parents as well without that, and just that knowledge. With ADHD in particular, 80% is genetically inherited. So and in other countries they diagnose automatically parents and children, whoever comes in the system, as part of that process, and we don't even have that knowledge. So we often see poor parenting skills and blame the parent rather than understanding their needs as well. Would then, by supporting those needs and understanding themselves, they become better parents and able to support those children.
A lot of late diagnosed individuals really struggle with masking. I think that's a really big thing. And the thing is when they don't know that they're autistic, or they don't want to say yes and sort of accept the fact that they are, then they are constantly comparing themselves to every single other person out there. And although there are positives to being autistic, there are also negatives, and there are some things that naturally we're going to struggle with more. So in all circumstances, whether you're younger or older, Obviously if you have confidentiality and stuff in place there, it's always good to see, just to check, and just to, it can be absolutely revolutionary for a lot of late diagnosed individuals, particularly a guy I know called Brian Bird, who I think he was diagnosed in his 50s or 60s, and he describes it as a new teenagehood.
Yeah.
a new life, a new fresh set of eyes, a new pair of shoes. It has absolutely changed his life massively for the positives.
Yeah. I think there's a big difference, isn't there, between seeing yourself as a failed neurotypical person and actually a really successful neurodiverse person, and what
Exactly.
that can do for your confidence and self-esteem is quite exceptional. How do you
Mhm.
think workers can listen and communicate more effectively with people with autism?
I think they need to they need to have a good level of understanding of things, but that's not necessarily through conventional training. It doesn't have to be, right, here's autism, it's a triad of impairment, so there's a little bit of sensory stuff on the side as well, understand that, and it's going to be easy. No, it's not. They forget to think that this, you know, the whole thing about autism is that, especially for people ASD1, perhaps having less overall support needs, um, there's a massive amount of variance in person to person, and they are actually adults, and they have, you know, approaching something in an interpersonal way is very different to understanding something in theory.
Yeah.
You could spend all your time in the world understanding how it's going to be a weird comparison, but understanding how gorillas work, or like the psychology of how the tribe works and things like that. But if you've never been around a bunch of gorillas, you don't really understand how to work with that. And it's kind of in a similar vein. Obviously, we're not gorillas. I think it kind of gives us a good kind of basis for that, and experience, and learning from other people's experience, and actually engaging with autistic people usually does a lot more than simply knowing what it is and the types of traits that it has. Because those are just things that we can use to identify people, not necessarily things that are going to help us.
Mm.
The number one thing that I think is very um, important would be direct communication.
Yeah.
So quite often, neurotypicals, non-autistic people, there's a big focus on indirect communication, and the way that you say things and the face that you use to say it, and the way that your body is when you say it, it has a lot to do with the message that comes across. Whereas when you're autistic, we like to focus on the words, the direct communication that's happening. So things like, um, so if you were to distill what you're trying to say into words, would it still make sense? If you just typed out instead of said it, does it still make sense? And if it doesn't, it's not going to be very effective when you're talking to an autistic person, or at least a large majority of us. So
Yeah.
I think, especially when you're working with children, especially when you're working with some autistic adults, just a baseline appreciation for this concept called cognitive empathy is very, very important. Cognitive empathy, it's not what it sounds like. It's Simon Baron-Cohen did this study where he split empathy into two different types. One being adaptive empathy, which is the ability to act appropriately when someone's experiencing a certain emotion.
Mm.
And cognitive empathy, the ability to tell just by looking at someone and listening to somebody, perceiving how they're feeling, not by direct communication. And autistic people, that we have a normal, if not slightly higher level of adaptive empathy, whereas cognitive empathy would really struggle. So there's been situations when I've, in my teaching assistant role that I used to do, where most of the autistic children, if they've hurt somebody, if they haven't seen a strong enough stimulus, like if the person's not absolutely crying their eyes out, or they haven't been told that this person is not feeling good, then they won't engage. But once you do, they are like the most they want to help the most. Like they
Mm.
are like super concerned in trying to make sure they're okay.
Yeah.
And that goes through to adulthood as well.
Yeah.
And I think with autistic children, sometimes if you want to use indirect communication, trying to exaggerate it a bit more than usual tends to help. I wouldn't recommend it with adults because they might find it quite patronizing,
Mm.
but that can definitely help. So I brushed on sort of alexithymia a little bit earlier, and I didn't really go into it that much. Alexithymia, as I said, it's noticing and categorizing emotions, but it's not to a point where we can be absolutely crying and not know how we feel. You know, it's a threshold. So it may be that most people, they'll be able to tell when they're a little bit annoyed, maybe 10-20% annoyed. They'll be like, oh, okay, right, I'm starting to get a little bit annoyed, I probably exit the situation. If you have alexithymia, perhaps you'll only catch it 50% angry, or 60 or 70% angry, or 80. And so, you know, if you get to a point where you're 80% angry and then are aware of it, it's going to have a massive impact in your ability to understand how you're feeling, and also regulate the emotion that you're feeling, regulate the anger or the sadness or the anxiety. And so we have meltdowns, we have shutdowns.
Mm.
We stim quite naturally, and that kind of helps dampen those emotions down in a very general sense. But it also has really big impacts in terms of communicating. Communicating feelings, it's quite a large part of socializing. You know, how do you feel about that? Oh, I felt this because of this. It's quite a human, a general human thing that people want to do, that you connect on your feelings and you connect on your opinions and thoughts. It's just that we tend to struggle in those areas, and it can also have an impact on just general daily life, because if you can't notice things, you can't log it in your memory that you're feeling like that. So if you have a really bad day at work and someone did something, and after the fact you had a meltdown, or you know something of that nature, no matter how sort of surface level it may be, it could be that we experience a lot of negative emotion because of something that someone's done, but we just don't clock it, or we don't remember or attach the emotion to that event. So it can cause some issues in that sense. I think it's, you know, I've talked a lot about the experiential side of things. You know, understanding it on paper is very different from understanding experience in autistic adults.
Yeah.
But I think, other than having a good awareness of co-occurring conditions and sort of putting more focus on that in terms of integrating and helping an autistic person, particularly in the workplace, or, you know, in every single circumstance, understanding the poor quality of life statistics is actually very important, and viewing those poor quality of life statistics in the lens of it's not the autism that's causing this. It's a combination of being autistic and living in a society that's not adapted well for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's interesting with the communication thing. I think it's even more of a barrier in Britain, because I've got friends in Germany and Holland who will literally just say, James, you're annoying me now. And that's normal conversation. Where British are like, oh, do you think we could do? And it's these kind of things that we just don't pick up on, and the direct things. And equally, we communicate in that way, and suddenly we're considered rude when actually we're just communicating in a very literal, straightforward way. So yeah, very interesting. How do you think we can better build a workforce that kind of understands these needs and are more confident in working with autism?
I think this is going to be a bit more of a short one than my other ones, because I feel like I've covered a lot of kind of the core concepts of, why we need to understand the experience. We need to understand neurodiversity, the positives. We need to understand the issues that are facing autistic people, everyday people who are, subject to bullying, isolation, which then goes on to cause a lot of co-occurring conditions. Understanding those aspects is very important because it gives us an idea of what we need to focus on in terms of improving things. And bullying and isolation, I think, could be applied to pretty much all environments.
Yeah.
Education, general daily living. You might be living in a halls of residence with a few other people. You're still in a social environment. And of course, if you're doing a job that requires interacting with people, no matter how sort of independent that job could be, if you're working for somebody, at some point you need to be communicating with people.
Yeah.
And a lot of the ways that people recruit is through things like interviews, which automatically puts us at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
Because it's basically designed to allow people with good charisma and good social skills to be picked out instead of the other people.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really give us an even playing field to really take our skills, put them into a paper, display those skills, and be accepted because of the high level of things that we've done or things that we're good at.
Yeah.
So we're ignoring that because they don't make eye contact. So they feel, they've done psychological studies on body language. If you have closed body language, if you don't make a lot of eye contact, if you don't have perhaps use facial expressions or body language, then of course you're going to be at a disadvantage because people are going to perceive those behaviors as if you were not an autistic person, if they don't know about it. So you're being compared socially to people who naturally find it a lot easier just by going through life. So I think that's definitely a massive point. And I think a lot of people, a lot of organizations, the world, we see autism, employing autistic people or investing in autistic people as a form of charity. So all of these poor autistic people, we need to fix them. We need to make sure that I think it's very underestimated how much having a neurodiverse individual can positively impact pretty much every environment.
Yeah.
And even the social environment. Perhaps if people were a bit more clear, a bit more direct, then there would be less room for error, because although you can interpret direct communication in a number of different ways depending on what a certain word means to you, not necessarily the definition, because we don't all know the definition of every single word unless we are like photographic memory or something. So all of our reference points for words are very different. So that's one area that communication could be interpreted differently. But there are so many different ways that indirect communication can affect us.
Yeah.
If you say something in a different way and someone interprets that as negative or positive or silly or angry, there's a lot more of a margin for error. And as much as people like to say that, this is good to do that, and it doesn't always lead to clear communication, and it's open to interpretation, and it could cause confrontation, and there's so many things that indirect communication could go wrong with.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes borrowing from the clarity and the directness of autistic communication can actually improve environments, even especially in workplaces and businesses.
Yeah.
Things like reducing sensory inputs. The company that I work for at the moment, called NDTI, they do these sensory assessments where they go into supported living see if there's anything bothering them, just by the fact being autistic and being able to pick up on it. And there's usually quite a lot. And once they go in and they fix that stuff, the quality of life of the people who live there is a lot better. And it's very, very small things like that, but you know, you can build up to bigger things like understanding neurodiversity, appreciating it, getting more autistic voices heard, trying to combat some of the mental health statistics, pushing for specialized mental health support for autistic people, because it doesn't work for a lot of us, and we do have very, very high rates of mental health.
Yeah,
there's so many things that I could tell about, but I don't want to keep you all day.
I could talk to you all day. Really could. It's absolutely fascinating, and you're so eloquent in expressing those things. I think the example, you know, in terms of our workers, what you spoke about the sensory things. I know if I go into a room for the first time, I'm acknowledging the smells. I'm acknowledging, you know, my sense of hearing is so much higher. So there's a hum. It's there in my head. The colors are coming back. Even the sound of my voice bouncing on the wall back again are all these things that I'm taking in. And it's the same with an autistic child in a classroom or ADHD child in a classroom as well. And it could be the buttons on the shirt that they're feeling because the school uniform, and they're full
Yeah, or
and
the
full.
tie.
Yeah, yeah. And then all these other inputs are coming in, and then we wonder why kind of things spill over. But a neurotypical person doesn't experience that, or it's completely subconscious. And so again, it's allowing to try and take yourself out of that place and understand what it's like for people like us to experience that. And sometimes they might not understand that someone said something and it's overflown, and they don't understand what it's that, and it isn't that. It's all the other things that are so full that thing then causes that reaction. So no, that's absolutely amazing. Is there? I think we've got 3 minutes left before this cuts
Yeah,
out.
that's why I said we'd round it up, because I was like, oh my god.
Is there like one last message that you'd like to give our workforce?
Please look at the statistics of autism. Type in any condition that negatively affects people's life quality, and look it up and Google it. I'm not going to tell you all of it, but if you type in autism and any mental health condition, pretty much it, things, whether it's eating disorders, whether it's mental health, whether it's physical things, whether it, you know, there's so many things that make living as an autistic person hard, and it's easy to see why we struggle so much because of our environment. And although there might be some biological implications, particularly around OCD and anxiety, from my research at university, doing my paper, which I turned into a documentary, it doesn't seem like there's enough evidence to say that conclusively everything's caused by us, and we are just experiencing these co-occurring things because we're autistic. I think it's the interaction of us and the lack of inclusive education, workplace, media, social landscape. That all has a massive impact in how well we do at life and how comfortable and happy we are.
Thank you so much for talking to us today, Thomas. It's been absolutely amazing, and I know we'll get so much out of it. Thank you so much for your time.
Of course, James. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Cheers.